Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Scary shit that happened to you as a kid that you still don't have an explanation for. When I was a kid, the neighborhood I lived in sat directly next to a partially abandoned scrapyard. It was clearly once used for making something, but there was absolutely no upkeep outside of old parts occasionally being dropped off and left to rust. In addition, it was only fenced off on one side, which left it completely open on the end connected to where I lived. Obviously, being an 11-year-old with little to no supervision, I would visit the place a lot just to explore and see what I could find. I thought it was so hardcore that I had to show my equally irresponsible friends one day. They come over, and we hang around for a bit before finding something sticking out of the ground near the far end of the scrapyard. It had rained pretty heavily the night before, so the sloped edges that formed a makeshift border had eroded, and something obviously came down with the dirt. It was a bone. My initial thought was that someone dumped their garbage nearby, and it was some kind of chicken or turkey bone, until my friend pulled it out of the mud. It was about 7 inches long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with bits of sinew still clinging to it. Obviously, we freak and call the cops. I still don't know what kind of bone it was. Pick-related. It looked kind of like this.
Kind of similar to OP when I was like 12 or 13, some friends and I were out exploring the woods behind our neighborhood. I lived in the country, and it was miles upon miles of woods and farmland back there. We used to find all sorts of cool and creepy shit that would never be found again. There was just so much land back there, and we didn't have any kind of map for any of it. We used to hike several miles, no problem, back into the woods. Well, one day we came upon a sort of tiny little shack at the top of a hill, deep in the woods. There was some kind of shop or garage operating next to the shack because of all the noise and smoke coming out of this little smokestack-type chimney. At the bottom of the hill was a massive pile of butchered animals of some sort, just blood and gore and dismembered parts. As evidenced by the blood smears on the hillside, whoever lived in that house on the little hill was just tossing butchered animal parts down to the bottom of the hill. Except a stream that ran into the nearby lake where the whole county got its potable water supply was right there. You could see the blood in the water. This person wasn't even trying to keep the carcasses and parts away from the water. As we stood in the trees, hidden, disgusted by this, we see a dude come out of the shop on the hill, and he's wearing a massive pig's head completely over his own head, like WTF. Shit was terrifying. He was carrying a basket that he dumped down the hill. An assortment of what must have been pig and cow parts rolled down the hill to join the rest of the bloody mess. I still remember the smell. It was unlike anything I've ever come across since. We were so sickened and terrified that he took off running back through the woods in the direction we'd come. One of my idiot friends screamed like a banshee as we took off, and the pigman atop the hill must have heard it for sure. We ran for I don't know how long until we all had to stop to catch our breath. We all stood in the woods trying to figure out WTF we had just seen, and we heard some sort of grunting and turn, and Pigman is right there, literally not 100 feet away, still wearing the pig's head and holding a shotgun in one hand. In the other, he's holding on a leash a pig, like the biggest pig I've ever seen. I'm sure it must be my child's mind reimagining it, but that pig must have been the size of a full-grown cow, and it had sharp teeth like a dog's. It was sniffing around like a dog, as if the pigman was using it to track us. We found a second wind and bolted and didn't stop till we reached one of our friends' houses. We told his parents, who straight up laughed in our faces, but we insisted so strongly that they called the police. They did. I went home from there and told my own parents everything. They didn't laugh at me and seemed genuinely concerned. Later that evening, a single cop showed up to my parents' house and I explained everything. I remember the cop showing no sign that he was disgusted or intrigued at all, and I found that odd. He didn't give any sort of feedback and ended up leaving, saying he'd let us know what they found or whatever bullshit. I knew then this wasn't right. I had just told him about a dude wearing a pig's head with a shotgun and some sort of monster on a leash, and how they had chased kids through the woods, and the cop acts like it's no big deal. A few days later, the same cop shows back up to my parents' house, threatening to arrest me for trespassing and making up lies about being chased through the woods. He tells me don't ever go back into the woods again, and that he should arrest me for trespassing onto farmer property. When my parents asked what they had found out, the cop immediately said, "No place like that exists," and accused me and my friends of making it all up. It ended at that, and we never found that place again, despite trying again to take pics. I remember the whole ordeal vividly. I'm 35 now, and my guess is it was someone important in the local community, possibly a judge, cop, DA, town board member, etc.
I should preface this by explaining my relationship with the paranormal, or more specifically, my relationship with my belief in the paranormal. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, aliens, or other dimensions. It all seems possible to me, but there's never going to be concrete evidence, and I'm not going to spend my mortal life worrying about what happens after I pass. In other words, I'm not religious. However, my mom is, and she's a firm believer in heaven, hell, and ghosts who visit Earth. When I was a child, she would retell her ghostly encounters anytime someone asked, or simply anytime there was nothing else to talk about. She never told them in the vein of an older kid trying to scare the younger kids at a campfire, holding a flashlight under their chin and cueing a friend to jump out screeching from a nearby bush at the punchline. But it was more like how one might recount a strange or interesting interaction with someone at work or in the grocery store. They weren't intended to frighten, but rather to convey her truth. She made the paranormal seem incredibly normal, and I think that's the reason I had such an easy time accepting all of her stories as absolutely true. As a Southern Baptist, my mom is far from the strange witch lady who lives alone and has an extensive collection of tarot cards and Gothic decor. In fact, she's very much the opposite. I don't think she comes off as loopy, paranoid, or schizophrenic to anyone, despite her tendency to casually insert her paranormal experiences into conversations with people she's just met. Naturally, I grew skeptical of all this as I got older. If something not easily explainable happened to me as a child, my mom would calmly say, "It was probably just the ghost." The ghost, referring to alleged spirit that allegedly roamed our double-wide trailer and allegedly often took the form of a member of the family to allegedly blend in unnoticed. Allegedly. After years of never questioning the suggestion that every strange thing I experienced, which upon later reflection often had a rational explanation, was the work of a paranormal entity, I began to reject the idea, much to the surprise of my mom. She would always ask, "You know you've seen and heard ghosts. Why are you trying to deny it?" And it would spark a tiresome debate, after which neither of us would change our minds. This never caused a rift in our relationship, but even as an adult, I still find myself in these arguments with her when I visit. I don't want to change her mind. I just want her to accept that I have different beliefs. Recently, in one of our paranormal spats, she asked me to explain an experience I had with my older cousin Manny that I hadn't thought about in years. Upon reflection, I realized that this story, if any, that sways me toward a belief in ghosts and an afterlife. I was 7 or 8, and Manny and his mom had come to my grandma's house to eat lunch. My parents and I lived right next to my grandma, so me and Mom would walk to her house for lunch every Saturday, and afterwards the adults would lounge about while Manny and I would go to my house and play the PS1. When lunch was ready, my aunt told Manny and me to go wash our hands, and since she was busy scrubbing a dish in the kitchen sink, Manny and I had no choice but to walk down the hallway and use the bathroom sink. It was always understood to me that my grandma's house was extremely haunted. Almost all of my mom's ghost stories and all of my grandma's ghost stories took place within the walls of that old manufactured home. I never would have shown it to Manny, but deep down, I was nervous to have to walk down that long, dark hallway, all the way to the end, to the bathroom, even with his company. Anyway, I immediately knew something was off as soon as we started down the hallway. The bathroom door at the end of the hall was closed, and artificial light was peeking through the crack between the bottom of the door and the floor. It was especially odd since everyone else in the house was in the kitchen or the dining room. Manny acknowledged it first. Somebody left the light on, he muttered. I couldn't tell if he was simply noting what he felt was obviously a minor lapse of memory from my grandma, or if he was thinking what I was thinking. As we got closer to the door, I intentionally slowed my pace and let Manny go ahead of me so that he would have to open the door. He was a couple of years older, and I didn't want him to know that I was afraid, unless I first knew that he was afraid. When he finally reached out for the doorknob, my heart was racing, and his must have been too, because I could see a slight tremble in his hand, and he was clearly slowing his motions to delay facing what was behind the door. I mustered the courage to grab his forearm and stop him from opening it, and I excused my actions by asking, "Wait a second, is Grandma in there?" I knew she wasn't. I had just seen her when she left the kitchen, and it would have been physically impossible for her to beat us to the bathroom without us noticing, but I was hoping to convince Manny to go back to the kitchen with me for a quick head count. Just as the words left my mouth, the doorknob began violently shaking. We both squealed, hands drawn to our chests, while the knob shook for about 3 seconds. We turned and sprinted back to the kitchen and explained what had happened to the adults. My aunt checked the bathroom, and it was empty. There were no signs of anyone getting in or out through the window. My aunt, mom, and grandma wrote it off as just another ghost, and so did me and Manny. This story is the hardest for me to explain, because it's an encounter in which myself and a witness, Manny, experienced exactly the same thing. We told everyone who would listen, but most of our friends thought we were just trying to scare them, and most adults thought we were just kids making stuff up. I wonder sometimes if someone actually did break into my grandma's bathroom that day. Perhaps the fumbling with the doorknob was an attempt to lock it. It didn't have a locking feature, to buy an extra bit of escape time. I just can't imagine someone breaking into that house in broad daylight. Firstly, Grandma lives in such a rural, open area that there would be hardly any place to hide a getaway vehicle, and it would take a lot of courage to just walk up to a house like that, unless you wanted a confrontation. And of course, if there was a burglar, they didn't want a confrontation, because they fled at the sound of a child's voice. Manny and I are in the latter half of our 20s now, and I don't see him except for sometimes on holidays when we're both able to make it to Grandma's. I want to ask him if he remembers this the same as me, but I think it would be weird to bring it up now. Anyway, sorry if that wasn't very climactic. That's just what happened as I remember it, and true stories aren't always entertaining. This legitimately makes me wonder about ghosts and stuff sometimes. And when my mom asks me to explain this one, I'm stumped. Thanks for reading.
Hey man, you and your mother remind me a lot of me and my mother. She's not very religious though, although she has seen many spirits. I'm skeptical, but I have seen things that have made me question things. If anyone wants to hear any stories, I wouldn't mind telling them. They're not amazing though. Okay, I'm a pretty bad storyteller, so here we go. Some background. I used to live with my mother in the Welsh Valleys in a dead-end town in the middle of nowhere. Nearby is a forest that climbs higher and higher into the mountains, which leads to plateau plains, which leads into a very large forest which will be the topic of the story. These forests scare my mother, who is deeply spiritual. She insists there's cults or some sort of ape creature living there. 19. My friend and I want to go camping in this large forest, have tent and provisions prepared. My mother is very upset and doesn't want us to go, practically begging us not to go. There's something up there, Anon. Please don't go. Laugh at her and insist we will be fine and nothing weird would happen. We were very wrong. We spent about an hour and a half trekking to the forest. We walk around a bit to try to find a good spot. We had never been here before. The first thing that's weird is previous pic. It looks like a car had crashed into a tiny little shantytown/house. There aren't any roads around. Okay, well that's strange. We keep walking and come to a spot, pic-related. It's beautiful and has a very magical feeling to the place. We set up camp and had a good time making a little campfire and cooking food and listening to music. It's around 6:30 p.m. and it's starting to get dark. We get into the tent and try to get some sleep. Neither of us are very tired, so we keep talking. Hey man, so? There's a twig breaking quite close, sounding like it's coming from the cliffs above us. Previous pic. We look each other in the eyes and we're like, that was weird. We keep trying to talk, but every time we talk, we are interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Every time we stop talking, the footsteps stop. It's now getting very close. We look each other in the eyes and hold the silence for 30 seconds. Very loud ape-like sound comes from the opposite direction, the sound extremely inhuman and sounded like an ape. We both look each other in the eyes. We're leaving and abandoning our tent and everything, fuck it. We get our shoes on as soon as possible and start walking back in the near pitch black darkness. I use my phone as a torch. It had 10% battery left, so we needed to get back as soon as possible. We get lost and take the wrong path to a dead end. Voices from all directions start making the same inhuman voices at different times, like they're communicating to each other, officially terrified. We start running in the opposite direction and find the path that leads back to town. We head up the path and reach the plateau, and we feel safe. Not much happened on the way back home apart from 100 sheep blocking the way to the forest leading to town. When I got home, my mother was so relieved that I got home. Apparently she had been crying all day and knew something bad was going to happen. When we went back to get the tent, everything was untouched. If anyone wants to hear any more stories, I don't mind. Okay, I'll rattle off a couple of short ones, 7 or 8, living in a different place in West Wales with my mother and sister. Out of the corner of my eyes, I keep seeing a little girl in a white dress when I'm coming down the stairs quite often. My mom asks me if I've seen any spirits that look like a little girl with a white dress. Say yes, we've both seen her. Hatman 10. Sleeping on the couch watching TV. Feel a presence. Look over my shoulder behind the couch. A very tall shadow person with a hat is staring into my soul. He doesn't move and I can see him as clear as day. My only reaction is to bury my head into the covers until I pass out from exhaustion. Tell my mother what I've seen. She says she's seen him too, and many others in my family, who aren't into spooky stuff, have seen him too. I shrugged the Hatman experience off as I got older as hypnagogia, but a couple of years ago, whilst I was scrolling /x/, I saw an image posted very similar to pic related, and I was overcome with pure terror, like a deer caught in the headlights of a car. How can all these people imagine the same exact person? A side note, my mother has had a lot of paranormal experiences too. Some of them are very dark, but I don't remember them. Here's a tiny psychic story. My mother is at a bar with my ex-stepfather. Guy comes over that knows my stepfather, introduces himself. My mother explains that she sometimes reads palms, and he asks to get his read. She says, "I know this sounds weird, but you have a big scar around," points where the scar is on herself, "here on your abdomen." The guy goes white as a sheet and takes my stepfather to the bathroom. The guy is like, "What the fuck, bro? How the hell did she know I had this scar?" And shows him the scar exactly where my mother said.
I was around 9 or 10 years old. I was in 5th grade. We used to live in a small apartment. The boys sleep in one room and the girls used to sleep in the bigger room, the master bedroom. The apartment only had one bathroom all the way in the kitchen. So at night we all make many trips to the bathroom without turning on the lights in order not to wake my brothers. And my brothers did the same for us. One night I had to go. It was late into the night, I guess around 2 or 3 a.m. As I walked towards the bedroom, I saw a silhouette of someone in the living room sitting facing me. I assume it was my older brother or my dad. As I passed by it, he'd turned to follow me as I walked by. I was half asleep and did not thought much about it. I went pee and head back. As I'm passing by the living room again, his head turned as I passed by the room. Then I say, "Night." No response. I say, "Dad, is that you?" Again, no response, but I know it looking towards my general direction. I say, "Miguel." Older brother. No response. I got scared and turned on the light to see who was there. The apparition vanishes seconds after I turn on the light, but for a small glimpse I saw it. I saw a pale face, dirty hair and facial hair, but the thing that scared me the most was that he did not eyes. I screamed when my dad and my sisters came running to see what was happening. When they get to me, I'm crying and my mum comes and hugs me, but I can't make sense. Everyone was scared, thinking it was a break-in. I'm pointing at the sofa in the living room, but they are struggling to understand what happened. I began to tell them that I saw someone and had no eyes, and my dad and mum dismissed it as a night terror. But my mum is holding me and tells me everything will be all right. After that night, I began waking my mum to accompany me to the bathroom. As time passed, one occasion, my dad brings that incident to me now as an adult, just to tell me that he witnesses the same ghost in different occasions when we are to live there.
Your story reminds me of the time I used to live with my grandparents. A lot happened there, but I want to tell the part similar to your theme. I'll write more parts later. Everywhere my grandpa lived, some beings followed. Over time, I came to realize a witch is stalking him. In fact, I remember my mum telling me about a witch a few times, but being so young, I didn't really know what that meant. My only experience with witches at that point was a TV show called Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Anyway, this home I lived in was hexed simply because Grandpa lived there. I saw many things, from shadow people to Satan. This particular incident is about the living room couch. My grandma is diabetic, which means she can't really hold in any pee. She also can't resist the urge to drink water. So when the urge came about at, say, 1 a.m., she had to go. She has to go through the most haunted area of the house if she wants any juice. The corridor. Rather than going alone, she woke me up. I was just an elementary boy. And unlucky. She didn't want to wake up Grandpa because he had work at 5 in the morning. She grabbed my hand and off we went. At these times, we made it to the kitchen with no issues. As soon as we arrived, Grandma turned on the lights. She grabbed some orange juice, then went to the bathroom. It all took like 3 minutes. From the kitchen, you have access to the living room. From the entrance, you can see most of it, if the lights are on. Standing to the left of the fridge, I could see the big couch. Laying on the couch was a black figure. Every time, and I mean every time I noticed it, he would raise his head and glance at me. This happened every night. The pattern was always the same. He would raise his head and then attempt to sit up. He would fail a few times. He would then finally use his elbows to support his weight. His spine was at a 45-degree angle or so he wasn't fully sitting. He just wanted to stare back at me, it seems. I call it a he because he didn't have long hair. During these stare-downs, I always tried to identify him. I thought maybe it was my uncle who also lived with us. I began to feel bad at first. Grandma turning the kitchen lights on kept waking him up. But then I realized Uncle had a rectangular head. This figure had an oval. Eventually, Grandma noticed, after a few days of this, that I kept contacting this shadow figure. She noticed me always staring in the same direction. She saw the figure with its elbows keeping it up. She gasped and exclaimed that I should never look at those creatures. She then said, "We urgently need to go back to our room." As soon as she grabbed me to push me towards the corridor, that figure jerked its body. It was now sitting on the couch rather than laying, feet and legs off the couch and on the carpet, his body facing the TV. Except his back was hunched. His body language seemed defeated/depressed. We left in such a hurry that Grandma didn't even turn the light off on departure like she usually did. Ever since then, that figure began a new pattern. After sitting up with its elbow, he would eventually turn his body to just sit properly, but in a slumped position. Feet planted on the floor. That thing was like a cue, a timer. When he sat upright, it was time for Grandma to finish drinking and leave. This lasted a few days. On the final day, he stood up, body straight like a soldier. I say final day because that was the last time I saw anything in the living room. Grandma's diabetes did not cure overnight, however. She still needed to go grab a sip of Kool-Aid. We took the same route, the only route. Through the corridor we went. This night was different. There was some light in the corridor, leaking for the small opening under the bathroom door. Someone was showering at this hour. I was relieved because it made me feel less lonely. To the left of the bathroom is the kitchen containing our target fridge. Grandma offered me a glass of water that night. I remember that night so well. No shadow man in sight. As we return, I am feeling more confident. We enter the corridor one step. I stop and ask Grandma, "Who is in the bathroom?" She did not fully get to finish her sentence. "I don't know." We hear a squeak. The shower knob turned, turning off the water, then a swift brush of the shower curtain, wet footsteps running towards the door. Tath, 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 tath. It all happened in 1 second. This shadow behemoth violently turned the doorknob and opened the door. I only saw a glimpse of it before it turned off the light. It moved right in front of our path. It was not the shadow man from the living room. This thing was massive, but still a shadow creature. All black, no face. It was so wide as if 3 fully grown men shared the same shirt. This thing had long hair as well, massive head to go along with its massive body. I noticed part of its right arm, the arm that flipped the light switch, was still in the bathroom, but the bathroom door was mostly closed, maybe an inch open. This confirmed the shadow was, well, a shadow. Paper thin, but so wide. As my night vision adjusted, I noticed it grab its locks. It pulled on it to the point where its head slightly cocked to the right. I hung on to Grandma, who just looked so small in comparison. Her diabetes rendered her short and thin. She was easily 1/6 the size of this thing in front of us. This thing was way bigger than the couch shadow man. The shadow man from the living room was normal adult-sized, bigger than Grandma, but not superhuman. Since this mass was blocking the way to the bedroom, there was no sleeping there tonight. After standing there feeling too afraid to move, let alone scream, Grandma turned us around. We went past the kitchen and into the living room. I glanced at the couch and saw nothing. I didn't dare look behind me to see if the big thing followed. Grandma took me past the front door and outside. We had a few chairs on the front porch. We sat there just in silence. I assumed we would just sit here until sunup, maybe even sleep there. Grandma is diabetic and needs proper sleep though. She took us into Grandpa's van and reclined the seat. We slept in the van after all. I'm just glad we didn't sleep in the living room. Next day, I had time to collect my thoughts. Grandma hated discussing the paranormal, so she wouldn't answer any questions. Grandpa always gave the same response. Don't worry, just ignore them. I only had myself. That mass from last night seemed familiar, I thought. It took a bit of pondering, but I eventually figured it out. Down the road is a hair salon. It has its own towering advertisement, like how McDonald's has its own big M sign. On that salon sign was a simple shaded drawing of a woman. Its hair was very similar to that of the shadow behemoth, as if the shadow monster copied it and failed, ending up instead with a corrupted version. This made me shiver. Did the spirits leave the house and made it down the road? Or did they join us for a car ride? How did they become aware of that image?
Good stuff, Anon. Where did this happen?
Oddly enough, in a home that is by a very busy intersection. A freeway, really. Thousands of cars would travel by, and none of them know they drove by an address where people levitate, and Satan himself showed himself. A concrete jungle here in Texas, surrounded by over 20 fast food restaurants, 4 car dealerships, and a bank. Giant Walmart down the road. I remember buying loads of Pokemon cards from there. It stopped being haunted after Grandpa moved. He moved into a bigger home with his son, a rectangle head. That home also became haunted, of course. Uncle had enough and kicked out Grandpa. Grandpa kicked out by his own son. And just like that, paranormal activity ceased at my uncle's new home. I'll write more later tonight.
A lot of grandma house stories, so I'll add my own. To be exact, my great-grandmother's house. So my great-grandmother, when she was alive, used to live in a Dutch colonial house in Southeast Asia, PIC-related. This was back in the mid-90s, a few years before she passed away at the age of 98. She used to live in this sizable property only with one of her daughters who never married, my grand-aunt, and one local helper to take care of the house. The layout of the house itself is shaped like 2-letter L piled on top of each other, where the top L is inverted. So there's a small courtyard in the middle of the building. My dad recently told me that they at one point explored ways for the house to be recognized as a local heritage site, because frankly houses like these are becoming extinct in the city that I lived in, so it really has that old-timey, nostalgic, and creepiness factor. From my earliest memory of visiting her when I was a kid, maybe from when I was 4 or 5 years old, I never felt right in that house. It wasn't until I was doing my undergraduate studies, my grand-aunt still lived there alone, after my great-grandma passed, that I had enough courage to explore the house in its entirety. And we usually have family gatherings there at least 3 times a year. When I was a kid, I would always dread going to this house. If we were in the house and dusk is about to come, I would kick up a fuss of wanting to go home. One time my dad proposed that we spend the night to keep my great-grandma and grand-aunt company, and I remembered I cried wanting to go home. It was something about the layout of the house, the smell, the hodgepodge of colonial artifacts and paintings, the slightly hidden rooms and corridors, and not to mention the weird vibes I keep getting from random corners of the house. Worst of all, there's a big well at the very back of the house, near the kitchen and the helper's room. So this well has always been a point of fascination for myself since I was little. Whenever I think of that house, the well is usually the second thing that comes to mind after the house itself. The well hasn't been used for God knows how long, and is always covered up tightly by rather thick wooden planks with a square-shaped hatch that you can open on one side of the well. Of the times I went near the well, I always remember it to be closed and padlocked, probably to prevent us grandkids from playing around there and falling into it. Now this is where it gets interesting. One day when I was in 5th or 6th grade, we had a family gathering at the house in the middle of the day for lunch. Almost everybody in my extended family from my dad's side was there. Both my dad's parents had already passed, so they were the only notable people missing. My great-grandma outlived them both. So in broad daylight after lunch, I was playing and talking like 6th graders with my brother and 2 of my other cousins. We were in the dining room that has a door that leads into the courtyard. And once you step out of the door, there is an outside corridor with a toilet, kitchen, helper's room, one mystery room to the right, and the well at the very end of the corridor. At one point, little me needed to go piss, so I had to go to the toilet outside as it was the closest. As I stepped out, I remember that one of my aunts was in the kitchen with the helper because I passed them and saw them preparing something. Went into the old toilet that also gave the creeps, did my business, and quickly stepped out again. At that moment, something just told me, or the voice in my head, told me to look right towards the well. Lo and behold, the hatch that was supposed to be closed and locked was noticeably open. Being slightly adventurous and curious, I opted to approach the well and wanted to see it myself, and wanted to see just what's inside that well that has been a source of curiosity. As I approached the well, I remembered feeling this sensation as if a gust is coming from inside the well. As I stood right beside the well, I mustered up any courage I had and peeked into the hatch. Nothing. Just pitch black, smelled musty, damp, and nothing else remarkable. So I withdrew my head from the hatch and just stood there by the well for a good minute or so, just taking in the atmosphere of being there, at a location where I've never had the courage to go before. Shortly after, my aunt who was in the kitchen noticed me standing there, called out my name, and approached me. She wanted to know what I was doing there, so naturally I told her I wanted to see what's inside the well. As she was walking towards me, she muttered out something along the lines of nothing good or nothing worthwhile. When she finally got to me, her face changed to that of surprise. She asked me why the hatch is open and gives me a minute lecture on how dangerous it can be. I could tell that she was struck by the fact the hatch was actually open. As she herded me back into the dining room, she talked with the house helper in a stern tone, telling her that the hatch is open. Asked the helper in somewhat of a panicky, "Why is it open?" and asked that the helper close the hatch again. The helper was as puzzled as we were. She told my aunt that she hasn't been near the well for days. That's when my aunt's face started to turn pale. I knew that something was not right, as how they should be. As that realization set in, without much thought, I just shot a question to my aunt about the well. Mind you, we were still in the kitchen, so it was just the 3 of us. I asked her, "What's up with that well?" My aunt was rather hesitant, but she figured I was big enough to understand. It was then she told me that the family believes there is something, some energy, being, or spirit, that dwells in the depths of the well, and she said whatever's in there is attached to our family. Weird side note, I already wrote a long continuation of the story, and the text erased itself as I was about to post it. Anyways, as we were just finishing up the story, we heard the sound. Clack, clack, clack. My aunt stepped out of the kitchen and she just froze in place. I came out to where she was standing and gazed towards wherever she was looking. The goddamn hatch was now closed. WTF. My aunt motioned for the house helper to come look and commanded her to find the key to the padlock and lock it up again. A few seconds after, one of my uncles came out of the dining room wanting to go to the toilet. He was wondering what we were up to there. My aunt simply replied, "It's the damn well again." My interest piqued. I asked, "Again?" My uncle, being the joker that he is, replied, "It has a thing for kids. You see, anons, all of my aunts and uncles, including my dad, had lived in this house a number of years as they were growing up." At that moment, my uncle began reminiscing with my aunt about the time he saw a figure staring at the well, only for it to disappear when he caused a commotion by calling out his other siblings. My aunt then replied with a story of her own, about when she once was going to the outside toilet in the middle of the day and saw the well area being darker than the rest of the outdoor area. Apparently, a number of weird happenings have occurred related to the well. Clothes, cards, and decorations from the house were found around the well that were not supposed to be there. After a moment of storytelling, my uncle called out to my dad, who was in the dining room, telling him that I had just experienced the well. My dad just laughed and tried to calm me down. He casually mentions that one of his cousins almost fell into a well in the 70s, and that's why they boarded up the well. He also said they thought about destroying the well and burying it, but my great-grandma opposed to the idea. I wish that with all the people outside now, it was the end of the weird encounter that day. Maybe it was my heightened sense of fear or curiosity. I kept having bad vibes from the direction of the well. My aunt went back into the kitchen, my uncle went in and out of the toilet, the house helper found the key and locked the hatch again, while my dad and I walked around the courtyard. He introduced me to his former room, across the courtyard from the kitchen. We went in and it was evident nobody has been living there for years probably. It was all dusted up, there were stacks of old books and magazines, and there was the unmistakable smell of mold, I think. As we were in there, my mind was still fixated on the well. I threw glances every few seconds just to be sure it was actually closed. What I didn't expect was that something was brewing in the room as well. As my dad began to step out the door into the courtyard, I trailed him for 2 or 3 seconds, and that's when I heard like either a murmur or a faint sob from inside the room. Writing this still makes me shiver. I turned around, looked around the room, and my eye became fixated on this chest that was in one corner of the room. Thinking I had enough excitement for one day, I tried to brush it off and walked right out of there without looking back. Didn't even tell my dad. So yeah, that's my story. Today, the family is still trying to sell the house. My grand-aunt is now living with one of her sisters. But from the stories I've heard, it's as if the house does not want to sever ties with our family. There have been numerous attempts at renovating it and cleaning it from its clutter, but there are always weird occurrences going on in each of the attempts. Even now, as I'm living on the other side of the world, memories and images of that house are always vivid. I haven't been there for almost a decade now, but there's always a part of me that wants to go back and explore.
Hopefully we don't 404. I am the anon with the grandpa who is stalked by a witch. So much happened, but I will pick just one more story to tell, at least until the next thread. I wasn't sure which part to tell until I reread my posts. I will tell the part about Grandpa getting kicked out of his own son's home. First, a little backstory. These creatures that haunted my grandpa and his children, including my mum, have been around since before I was even born. For example, when I saw them for the first time, I thought it was a new discovery. They were dormant for a few years until the month the shadow people attacked me. I know because I lived in that address for a year or two with no interaction. And then they came. My mum visited and saw them. She didn't even flinch. She just nodded and then told me to just stay away from them. Her sister, who was a teen at the time, was used to their presence as well. She just laughed and taunted the spirits, often whistling at them to get their attention, treating them like dogs. Grandpa also never flinched at their presence. In fact, I've seen him punch one of them. Moving on, the reason we moved out of the home with the shadow couch man is because a couple months later, violence escalated. Grandpa and his son, not my dad, pooled money together to find a bigger place. The mortgage was under Grandpa's name for some reason, so he had the power to kick Grandpa out. The first month they moved into the new house, I was excited. They had such a big lawn, I dreamt of a tree house and camping in the backyard. I moved in with Mom, so I didn't live there, but still. Parents brought me over for a visit, and I began to play with my uncle's daughter, who was my age. We played tag and stuff. While playing, I saw from the corner of my eye black lumps on the grass. Gradually, I began to make out the shapes. Those lumps were actually snakes. The second I looked at their direction, they began to sink and vanished after a few seconds. They were pretty big, like the size of an adult man's arm. At the time, I didn't know snakes were venomous, so I went to inspect them carelessly. I assumed they lived in holes, which would explain them disappearing, but I found no openings or mini tunnels. I didn't think much of it. I went back to playing with my cousin and brought it up. She agreed that big black snakes kept reappearing periodically, so I wasn't crazy. After a bit of playing more, I began to feel crazy, however, because at one point, I saw 4 of them together, with just a bit of spacing between them. They all sank out of existence within a short moment. I felt alarmed and ran to my parents. My parents and uncle were sitting near the doorway of the patio. As I tried to interrupt their conversation, I felt they were having a serious discussion. Uncle was telling my parents about the spirits in this new house. They all looked at me and asked me what I wanted. I told them about the snakes, and then my uncle cut me off. He screamed at my parents, "Ooh, yeah, that's right. And that's another thing. There's also snakes in the yard here. They appear and then disappear." My dad was new to all this, so he seemed bothered. He married into the family. Meanwhile, my mum just seemed indifferent. She was used to this after all. My dad thought Uncle was lying. By the time my next visit to Uncle rolled around, they had gotten a pet dog, a small white dog with curly hair. It had a temper. Because it was so aggressive, I couldn't play with it. Since it was left outside, I decided to play with my cousin indoors. His name was Charlie, and I only got to meet him once. While playing with my cousin in her room, we were disturbed by screaming outside. He, look! We darted outside. From the door leading to the backyard, we couldn't see anything. We then heard shuffling to the left of the home. Uncle was by the side of the house, in front of the electric meter box. He was hidden by a sharp turn. As we waltzed towards his direction, we saw he looked puzzled and shocked. He was holding down a shovel by force. He began to grumble to himself rather than to us, which was typical of him. I had it. What happened? I had it. I saw one of those snakes. I had it. I slammed it down with a shovel, but still it got away. By going through the earth. But I had it. Had it pinned down. When my parents came by to pick me up, I heard Charlie barking like mad. That would be the last time I heard Charlie, who was pretty quiet during the shovel fiasco. When it was time to revisit, my parents broke the news. They told me Charlie was found dead in the backyard one morning. I confronted my cousin about Charlie. We were in the backyard discussing. As I listened to her explanation, I saw the snakes in the background going in and out of reality. The usual. She said Charlie slept outside and that he liked to dig under the shed. He would crawl half his body into this tiny house in the middle of the backyard, and that's how he typically slept. When it was time for breakfast, they would whistle, and he would dig out of the shed shelter. On this particular day, Charlie didn't respond. Cousin went to drag him out from under. His head was missing. Uncle told everyone that it must have gotten into a fight with another animal, and it ran off with its head. I didn't believe that explanation at all. But my cousin did. They ended the story with Uncle placing Charlie's corpse in a bag and then throwing him into a dumpster. That part, for some reason, disturbed me the most. Since Grandpa lived with Uncle and not me, my own home was calm and normal. It's been a few months since I moved out of Grandpa's. I had a PlayStation 1, which had its price cut in half upon the release of the PS2. All we could afford, haha. And that was life, really. Pre-Adult Swim, Cartoon Network, and Spyro games. I adjusted pretty well to this piece, so imagine my shock when later that day, after returning from my uncle's home and hearing about Charlie's death in depth, I was attacked. I was laying on my race car bed when I felt something heavy land on my chest, one of the black snakes. It flailed around mindlessly, no direction, no purpose. It just spazzed out. I am one of those people who would begin to see the world in slow motion when adrenaline hit its climax. As my vision adjusted in between my screams, I noticed this snake was not actually a snake. Sure, it was big and black, but it had fingers. It was also not covered in scales. It was hairy. This was the cryptid of Mexican legend, the hairy arm, or as it is usually called, La Mano Peluda. Not a full minute went by that my parents ran to my bloody yelping. As soon as I saw Dad at my door, I managed to roll out of bed and fell to the carpet. I began to crawl towards my parents. My dad was not at all familiar with the paranormal, so he must have assumed a burglar was under my bed or something. The hairy hand was still flailing about like a fish out of water. It had a source, too. From my point of view, it seemed the arm originated from the side of the bed pushed against the wall. Dad grabbed the race car bed and slid it across the room. The hand shot up straight and then quickly sank through the carpet. No man in sight. After that, my visits to Grandpa and Uncle became a rarity. Dad did not want me to associate with Grandpa anymore. Most of the time, actually, I wasn't even allowed to leave the truck and go inside the house. Grandpa always had to go to the front driveway to greet me. He would always give me some money. I know for a fact hauntings progressed in that house, but I wasn't allowed in, so I only heard the details through my cousin's account. Years later, my cousin told me she knew all along those snakes were not actually snakes. She told me those hands would often jump and slam themselves towards the kitchen window. They would stick to glass for a mere second before falling off. You could count all 5 fingers if you calmed down fast enough. It only happened to the kitchen window because that's the only window facing the backyard. No snakes appeared in the front yard. Grandpa knew too. Everyone would always flinch and jump and the smacking sound. Except for Grandpa.
I've seen a lot of stuff in my sort of block of suburbs in my life, but there's only one thing that I guess you could say happened to me. I live in what must be the suburban capital of the world, because that's all there is. And because I've lived here all my life, I know it like the back of my hand. I was walking home from a friend's one late night. Not a far walk, maybe 2 miles or so. I was close with them, so I probably walked 2, and from their house maybe 4 or 5 times a week. It was pretty late, after 2 a.m., but I frequently came home late, had my own key, etc. Anyway, I was almost home and was making the left turn onto what should have been my street, but it wasn't. Completely alien, different road layout, different houses, different streetlights. This was definitely not my street. In the moment I stopped and realized this, I got hit by the most intense feeling of panic I'd ever felt. It wasn't so much anxiety, as it was just this intense feeling of dread and repulsion, like I wasn't where I was supposed to be, and I had a violently negative reaction to it. Panicked, I turned and just bolted down the street that I'd come down, but it wasn't the same street. I didn't recognize anything, which only made the feeling of unease worse. I just kept running until I came into a local convenience store and ran inside. The lights were on, but I don't think there was a clerk behind the counter. I sped into the bathroom, locked the door, and just sat there trying to let the panic wash out. When I finally felt like I'd regained some sense of security, I checked my phone to see that an hour had passed. It was now 3 a.m., or close to it. I walked out of the bathroom, and the clerk was now behind the counter. He tried to say something to me, but it was like I was in shock. It was kind of distant. I ignored it and walked out, and found that I was at a convenience store maybe 6 miles from my house. Not willing to chance what happened again, I called a lift back to my house and got home safely. Shit still makes my skin crawl until this day.
I wonder how many ghost sightings are just people who take Benadryl and aren't used to it, or have a delayed reaction or something. Be me about 15 in high school. Have bad acid reflux and random shitty health problems that are really just annoying, not serious. Have to take a bunch of pills every morning. Being a who gives a shit teen, I stopped taking them after a short time. Anyway, one of the meds is promethazine, causes drowsiness. One day, take some Benadryl before bed because my nose was itching. If you know how bad the pollen gets in South Carolina, you'll be able to sympathize. The next morning, take some Benadryl before school. While on the bus, get hit with a crazy reaction to the Benadryl. Feel drunkish and sedated. On the school bus, I start seeing crazy shadow people running up and down the aisle. They're broad-shouldered and walk in a menacing way, like when someone is walking up another person to punch them. Kind of like a strut with their shoulders kind of swinging back and forth. Very spooky, but I know what's going on. Later at school, feel more sedated, so go to nurse's office. She knows I'm on meds that can make you sleepy, so she just calls my grandpa to come get me and lets me chill on one of the 2 doctor beds. While waiting, I go into full-on visual and auditory hallucinations, see completely new people I've never met, have conversations with them, see more shadow people doing a weird crouched run, probably lots of stuff I don't remember too. It all basically stopped when I got home, so that was cool. I feel like this type of situation could be responsible for at least some of these instances. Sorry I don't have a real story, but man, if you ever want to get really fucked up and hallucinate, Benadryl will fuck you up.
Be me, about 7 or 8 years old. Paranormal shit constantly happening to me. One particular night I woke up around 2 a.m. to the doorbell ringing. Not just one ring, but constant ringing. Look outside. My window faces the front yard. Tall man in a tattered overcoat and hat standing in our grass, staring back at me. Too dark to see face, only silhouette. Doorbell starts ringing faster along with knocking. The man never moves. I hide under my covers and eventually fall asleep with the knocks and ringing still going. Next morning, tell my parents what happened. Nobody else heard a thing and thought I was just dreaming. The next day, our doorbell stopped making the normal ding-dong noise. It still works fine, but it's just a loud buzzing noise instead. Fast forward a couple weeks later. Aunt comes to visit. Parents tell her about my dream. She makes fun of me for the rest of the day and teases me about ghosts. Next morning I woke up. Aunt is sitting at the table with my parents, visibly shaken. Ask what happened. Aunt says she was on the couch and heard the ding-dong of the doorbell. She got up to see who was outside, confused as to who would be visiting in the middle of the night. She looked through the glass in the door, but nobody was there. She goes back to the couch and sits down. Doorbell rings again. At this point, she's annoyed because she thinks it's kids playing ding-dong ditch. She swings the door open and nobody is there. She scans around and sees a man in an overcoat and hat standing about 200 yards, 180-ish meters, away under a streetlight. She slams the door shut and locks it before going back to the couch. The ringing starts again, but doesn't stop. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. Ringing lasts for several hours as she sits on the couch, freaking out. In both cases, nobody else heard the ringing or knocking. This is a small house, so you'll hear it from the furthest room with no trouble whatsoever. What my aunt doesn't know is that the doorbell doesn't ring anymore, just buzz.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.